Americans often think of the civil rights movement through its largest figures. While the well-known leaders of the era had impact, it was everyday Americans whose efforts created change and equality. It's seldom the stories of local people, communities, and actions that are told. For the first 300 years of education in the United States, schools, like many of the country's institutions, weren't intended for everyone. Since the first black public schools opened during Reconstruction, education was completely segregated. The first change to occur nationwide was the 1954 Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education, which ordered schools nationally to desegregate. While this case was a major win for the civil rights movement, the journey to school desegregation, especially in the South, was far from over. The South's first major school desegregation attempt took place in 1957 with the Little Rock Nine. These were 9 black students whose goal was to integrate Little Rock, Arkansas's Central High School. After being enrolled, they were constantly harassed and jeered by their white peers. While government intervention made desegregation possible in rare cases like in Little Rock, white Southerners were still fiercely committed to resisting Brown. For Southern political leaders, public facilities like schools, theaters, and restaurants had always been segregated, and this reality would not change. In 1970, the town of Starkville, Mississippi would change forever when the public school system desegregated. This served as a catalyst that reshaped the town's history and identity. In the 1960s, Starkville was a quaint college town of 14,000. Like most towns in the South, it was completely segregated by race. This, of course, was no accident. Both black and white communities were centered around their schools, and 2 separate school districts maintained social and physical barriers between whites and blacks. By 1969, not much had changed in Starkville. The city was still 2 separate communities, and schools were no closer to being united either. This would all change in July, when the Supreme Court decided in Alexander v. Holmes County Board of Education that Brown could no longer be ignored and that all schools needed to desegregate immediately. Desegregation in Starkville schools had been tried before.
We had freedom of choice first. And those that wanted to go over and to Starkville High School, white school, could. And some of the kids did.
During the 3-year freedom of choice period, starting in 1965, only 14 black students switched to white schools, and no white students went to black schools. This was normal among freedom of choice schools in Mississippi, with only 3% of black students attending white schools before 1970. Pressure to change would come from Starkville's black community, as the local NAACP chapter would organize boycotts to push school desegregation. Starkville school administrators battled with national officials repeatedly to keep freedom of choice as the only form of desegregation. On February 3, 1970, federal judge Orma Smith ordered Starkville Municipal Separate School District to desegregate. This meant that Starkville could no longer resist the Brown ruling and had to finally create a single school district. Once they realized desegregation was inevitable, white Mississippians decided to circumvent it by forming segregationist academies. These were private schools formed for the sole purpose of keeping white children from having to go to school with black children. Much of the support for these buildings came from the Citizens Council, a white supremacist organization with deep pockets to fund continued segregationist efforts. From 1969 to 1970, the number of these academies in Mississippi rose from 35 to 100. In the summer of 1970, segregationists founded Starkville Academy.
Now, I do remember losing white friends. You know, most people stayed with the public schools. The vast majority did. But I remember, probably 3 or 4 kids in my 2nd grade class that were no longer with us in public schools. They just vanished. And what they did, they went to Winston Academy.
Parents and their children have been working around the clock to convert this former tent manufacturing plant into an academy for grades 1 through 12. Most of the 1,400 white students in the district are now enrolled.
Meanwhile, desegregation was complex in Starkville's public schools. To be effective, desegregation had to be done correctly, and people had combating ideas on how to accomplish it. Although many plans came before the school board, 2 were seriously considered. One would be for all students in a neighborhood or ward to go to the same school. The second plan was for all students to go to one massive campus, known as an academic center. Many people complained that the first plan wouldn't act as true desegregation, as many neighborhoods in Starkville were majority black or majority white, and so true citywide integration would not be accomplished. The second plan was deemed unfeasible because it would require the construction of a large campus and would leave existing schools unoccupied. Ultimately, the decision was given to the citizens of Starkville, who could vote for any one of these options or a combination. Of the 2,100 forms sent, 1,900 have been returned, and in the end, Starkvillians decided that all students in a certain grade would all go to the same school. For example, all 10th through 12th graders would go to Starkville High, while all 7th through 9th graders would go to what was formerly the Black High School. Part of the order from the federal judge required the desegregation of teachers to come midway through the 1969 school year.
The selection of them was sort of unique, I suppose. The school board obtained a bingo machine, which I've been told came from the country club. And if they were going to, say, move a white second grade teacher to the black school and a black second grade teacher to the white school, they would take all of the second grade all the white second grade teachers, and the more experience you had, the less likely you were to be selected to go to the black school. When they turned on the machine, you can see the likelihood of a young, inexperienced teacher being selected was higher than an experienced teacher because the number of balls everybody had in the machine.
Judging by the way desegregation went for the teachers, the summer before the 1970 school year was tense. Desegregation in Mississippi high schools was known for racial feuding. The state capital, Jackson, was desegregated around the time, and hazing and violent threats towards African Americans were common in the newly integrated schools.
Didn't have any disturbances or anything like that, crazy stuff going on. We got along.
I think we just became a little more adjusted to seeing people we hadn't seen before.
Weren't any after-school activities and stuff. It was almost like they were afraid of this intermingling that was going on. I don't know, maybe that's not it, but it stopped.
One of the things that came to the forefront for our students on a level that they functioned together was the football team.
The football team played the biggest role for integration for us. It just encouraged the other guys that came behind us, hey, just what we're gonna do. We're gonna go do this, we're gonna play ball.
There was still some of the residual difficulty with being pushed into making a change that people weren't necessarily felt they weren't ready for. Of course, it was long overdue, but it was changes that people were still not necessarily ready for.
Another factor in the success of Starkville's desegregation was Mississippi State University. At this point, the university had been in Starkville for 100 years, and it was by far the biggest economic and cultural influence on the city. The presence of MSU meant that Starkville's population was better educated, more progressive, and less opposed to integration than many other small towns in the South.
It was a turning point. It was a turning point. Because a lot of racism was erased by the integration. And then probably if the integration hadn't came, you still probably had all that segregation and racism still going on.
Desegregation changed Starkville more than any other event in the 20th century. It changed the relationship between the white and black communities by ensuring the interaction and cooperation between them. The lasting effect of this is a strong public school system that is a point of pride for the entire city. While far from perfect, Starkville school desegregation was a defining moment in the city's history, and its positive effects can still be seen today.